bar none, everybody thought this was the dumbest thing I was doing in my life. They were like, "You're nuts. Why are you doing this?"
Everything is crushing down. Everybody's running away from tech, and you're actually moving towards this.
So I gave up this really great job, well-paying job, and all of a sudden, the internet bursts.
Today we get to talk to a person who said no to $400 million offer for Wix when everybody thought that was crazy. He is also the first investor in Skype, a survivor of the dot-com bubble, and a venture capitalist who isn't afraid to call out the fake in Silicon Valley. Welcome, Mark Tluszcz, the co-founder of Mangrove Capital, chairman of Wix.
Everything I do is about being contrarian. AI has turned us all into superhumans. It also turns a lot of us into idiots because we just repeat what it says. You need to be reading between 20 and 30 books per year. The first thing is, and I try to apply this to every situation in my life, is...
So today we get to talk to a person who said no to $400 million offer for Wix when everybody thought that was crazy. He is also the first investor in Skype, a survivor of the dot-com bubble. Oh, we're going to talk about that. That's going to be so cool. And a venture capitalist who isn't afraid to call out the fake in Silicon Valley. So we're going to have so much fun. Welcome, Mark Tluszcz, the co-founder of Mangrove Capital, chairman of Wix. I personally been using Wix. I just told him way over a decade. So I'm so excited to take you behind the scenes. Mark, thank you for being on the show.
Ilana, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to a very engaging conversation, right?
It's going to be so fun. And I also going to remind listeners one more thing. Remember, every week I select a question from our YouTube channel, Leap Academy with Ilana Golan, and I answer it after this conversation. I answer it live. It's going to be so cool. So today, Margie asked about how to land your first client when you don't have experience. What a great question. So stay tuned until the end. We're going to answer it. So Mark, I can't wait for this conversation. You have such an eclectic background. And if that's okay, I want to actually take you back in time because you as a kid were kind of roaming around different places before you landed in the US for college. Can you take me back there a little bit? Who was Mark?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that my parents, my father was American, my mother was South African from Zimbabwe, right? And I grew up in Africa most of my life as a child, so I went to the US for the first time when I was 18. But before that, I had the real privilege of living in the Congo, living in Egypt, living in Zimbabwe, and living in Belgium. And all of this really, I think, created something in me that was very different. I didn't have a traditional upbringing. I lived in countries that were not my countries by predilection, and really got to experience various cultures and various things. And I think what it really gave me as a gift beyond, I love to travel, I speak multiple languages, it just gave me the idea that, everybody is different, and that's fine, and I'm good with that. And as long as I can understand those differences, I can really engage with them and build things. And it really has gone a long way to serve me in my professional career. There's so many times in my life that I have to look back and say, you know what? That may not be for me, but it doesn't mean it can't be great, right? And I think that's that multiculturalism that you get living in all of these, arguably goofy countries, and then all of a sudden showing up, in the U.S. when I was 18 for the first time, and my father telling me it's time you become a bit American, and I was like, wow, man, I grew up in all these other countries, and so that was probably the biggest challenge for me is going from I was living probably from the age of 12 to 18 in Cairo in Egypt, and then put on an airplane and shipped off to go learn American and go to an American high school. And I think all of that just creates in an individual different things that are important to them.
Mark, was that frustrating, or were you grateful at the time, or is it only something that you can look back and say, now I'm grateful?
I think, it was just my life, and perhaps as you're growing up, teenager and beyond, you are the environment that you're in, and you're in the family that you're in. And for me, that was normalcy. It only came to me later that it really wasn't how everybody else was living their lives, and And I remember showing up to an American high school for the first time and just feeling, oh my Lord, where have I landed here? And so different. So I think all of that, yeah, no, it was my normalcy. It wasn't, I realized it
Right.
after, but I think it's the gift of not knowing that makes it whatever it is. And at the end now, of course, I can look back and say, God, I'm so happy my parents gave me that. They forced me to go to French schools. So we were English speakers at home, French at school. And it just made it that
Amazing.
also you were multicultural, multilingual, very, very young. And that just made, I think, who I was and helped me in the early parts of my career.
I love that because you can already tie some strings to why you invested in like Estonian company, whatever. Like we'll go there for a second, but before that, so you spent 10 years in Arthur Anderson, right? And so take me there a little bit because eventually you decide to leave, but take me a little bit into this experience. It was,
I
yeah.
think I was I went to university. I did a history and business degree. And, I was a prototypical kid who wanted to be in business. And, you had an option. You'd go work at a consulting firm or you try and become an investment banker. I still think many, many university grads today, those are their first paths, right? I'm going to go do that. And that becomes, that's greatness because I could do there. And I was very fortunate. I got a job in this great company. I had a number of mentors that mentored me along the way, but it really was, I think I didn't know any better when I started. It's
Right.
like everybody thought, oh, he works for, Anderson Consulting. That's so awesome. I was like, okay, yeah, it sounds pretty cool to me. And I spent 10 years there really just developing as a professional. And it's an experience I'd encourage, for a lot of people because you learn how to work in those large organizations. There's a lot to be said about a working methodology and a discipline of work that you get out of an environment that is so strict and at the
Yeah.
same time so demanding, right? I
Right.
think you have to be in these demanding places very early on in your life because it sets
Oh
the
yeah.
tone for who you will become later. We're not all born with this insatiable hunger to be successful. We're not all born with all the brains in the world, and we start off in our professional career. And I do think sometimes you can have false starts and bad starts. And I happen to have a very lucky start to my professional career by being there, by being surrounded by great bosses
Yeah.
and mentors who just over a 10-year period ultimately made me who I was in that first part of my career.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, I said working at a consulting firm today, I don't, I wouldn't encourage my kids to do it. But I do think I know a lot of kids their age, that's their number one goal, consulting or investment banking. And I think for a
Right.
few years, extremely useful because of the work habits that you develop and just the intellectual way of thinking, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard. They're harsh
Yeah.
environments to learn in. But
I
hey,
think
if
my
you're young
son
and you
still
can't,
wants it. My son still wants it. So
well, yeah,
we'll let
there's a
him.
there's a
We'll let him.
glory. Yeah, there's a glory associated, at least in the minds of young
True.
people, right? Oh, I'm going to
Yeah.
go work in those things. It's so awesome. You're like, no, it's great. But there's so much more to do in life than to be in those
I
organizations.
agree. So, Mark, is there like a certain moment in time when, because you're right, like in the beginning, I think all of these organizations, you can learn a lot, right? Like, I think there's a lot that we don't know. But was there like a certain moment where you're like, okay, this is it. Like, I need to do something different?
Yeah, for me, I ended up spending 10 years there, being very fortunate to really go up that corporate ladder quite fast. But I'd say, about after 8 years, I started questioning, not so much was I enjoying it, it was more, I don't see how this is going to fundamentally change for the next 30 years. Like,
Yeah.
and that started scaring me quite quickly. So the first
Right.
thing is, and I try to apply this to every situation in my life is, every day open your eyes and tell yourself, do I like where I am? Am I really enjoying what I'm doing? And, we all go through some ups and downs in situations, but after a period of time, you only got one life and enjoy it as much as you can. And yes, a job is a job is a job. But so for me, after, 8 years, I started questioning that fortunately for me, it coincided with the early kind of internet explosion of 96, 98 timeframe. And so all of a sudden in that 8-year period, not only was I having doubts around kind of my long-termness in this organization, but I started seeing this thing called the
Everything is
internet.
happening. Yes.
And I'm
Oh.
like, I can see the world changing, and yet here I'm stuck, doing this profession I've been doing for 8 years, and I just thought it was time to make a change. And when you spend so long in those organizations, leaving is very difficult because they pay you unbelievably well to stay when you're very successful in this
Yeah.
consulting and banking environments, and so it's hard to leave because all of a sudden you're downgrading. And I left to start my own firm. And so all of a sudden I went from having a business card that said Anderson Consulting, which that was supposedly awesome, to, Mangrove Capital Partners that nobody knew. And so that takes a bit of adjusting, I think,
It
too, as well.
takes a lot. So I want to go there for a second. First of all, did people think that this is like a really dumb move, or did people think, oh my God, Mark, this is amazing?
I'd say bar none, everybody thought this was the dumbest thing I was doing in my life, which again, experience has told me that should have been a positive signal, right? Because they weren't thinking out of the box. But yeah, they were like, you're nuts. Why are you doing this? And my mentors in that organization felt betrayed by me, and all of that. But at the end, again, you got to take control of your life. As long
Yeah.
as you do it in a professional and good manner, it really is about you and where you want to take your life. And I thought it was time to take a shot on this internet thing. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was, because I was stuck in this consulting environment, the internet kind of crept up on me. I didn't just embrace it. It just kind of crept up on me. And I have a friend of mine, she's a movie director in the US, and at the time she called me up and said, there's this thing called the internet, it's gonna awesome. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And think about what I'm doing now. And she's like, no, you don't understand, this is amazing. And she's a very forward thinking person. And every time she says something, I said, okay, now she said something serious, I had to go read up on this. And she just opened my eyes to what the internet was happening. To
Wow.
be fair, I was living in Europe. The internet was much more of a US phenomenon at the time as well. And so she saw a lot of that happening in the US, which we weren't seeing in Europe. But really, she pushed me over the edge. And she knows this, and I'm forever thankful to her about doing that. And so, you get inspiration from different places in life. And that was one of the inspirations I got, which is, hey, open your eyes. The world's going by you. And you could be part of it, or if you wait too long, you'll miss the boat. So that was kind of
Yeah.
my impetus into the internet.
Ooh, and I love that. And again, you decide there's a big difference between starting a small business and trying to launch a VC firm from scratch,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah,
so take me
yeah,
a little bit towards that moment when you were saying, you know what, I actually gonna invest in other companies, because this is like everything is so new. Like venture capital was not that
yeah.
popular. It wasn't like
No.
so take me there to that
I had been an
decision.
apprentice investor for a number of years with the bonuses I was getting from my consulting gig. And I had fortunately backed my younger brother. He had built a microbrewery in the US. And I had helped fund that microbrewery. And it turned out to be quite a successful story for him, and of course, financially for me as well. When I decided to leave Accenture, I said, I really want to build my last company. In the sense of, I said, I'm really going to put everything I have into this. And I need to focus on building something that I'm going to still be doing 25, 30 years later. And that was my goal, whether I could do it or not. But I was and from day one, I decided I don't want to, I'm not raising a fund. I'm building a firm. And so everything has to be associated. I had to have the brand of the firm. I had to have the partners I wanted in my firm. I had to have the culture in my firm. And the culture was a culture of innocence, of course, because we arguably didn't know very much. But we were able to raise the first fund on the story that, hey, the internet bubble burst in the U.S., but not here in Europe. As if that should have made a difference. But we got the community of I live in Luxembourg, and the Luxembourg ecosystem really gave us the money to start our first fund in the firm, and they
I
gave
want to
me
go
our
there.
shot, right?
I want to
Yeah,
go
they
there. I
gave us
want
a
to go
shot.
there. Yeah, they gave you a
Yeah,
shot in one of the hardest times ever. So take me there for a second, because the year is
yeah,
2000 to 2002, or somewhere around
yeah.
that
We're
ballpark, right?
miserable.
Everything is crushing down. Everybody's running
Yeah,
away from tech. There's a lot of things that exploded because they promised the world, and it was like just exploding in everybody's face. And you're somehow not fleeting the heck out of this. You're actually moving towards this, and you're able to get people to believe in your vision. Tell me like how, Mark?
Yeah, I resigned in I think January 2020, right? So I gave up this really great job, well-paying job, and all of a sudden the internet bursts, right? And I'm like, oh Jesus, now what? And fortunately, small countries, if you're from Israel, you know this. Luxembourg is of course much smaller than Israel, but
Yeah.
small countries, you know a lot of people and things like that. And I'd been talking to them about this, and they were saying, we really want to give a shot at this tech thing. And I don't think a lot of them believe that the implosion of the U.S. would naturally flow into Europe, and so that moment that they had of not really understanding the market gave me the opportunity to quickly close my fund, right? And so we're able to very quickly convince them, hey, yeah, you're hearing noise in the US, but there's still opportunities here, and we think we can develop something here. And look, we're three smart guys, we're going to go do this. And I think it was innocence that allowed those investors to back us. And they
How
did.
many
And again, in the
no's?
small
How many no's did you need to go
oh,
through?
oh, I'd say we ended up having about 25 investors. And I think I probably went to every single capital of Europe, visited at least 30 or 40 investors in each of those cities. So, it's in the hundreds of no's for 25
Wow.
for 25 yeses. I mean, look, when we started this off, I remember sharing hotel rooms with my partners. We would drive down to Geneva, the three of us in one bedroom, just to save enough money to be able to go on that next trip. And by the way, that's exactly how I think early stage should be, whether it's a firm, a company, or whatever. You got to hustle, man. And
Yeah.
money doesn't grow on trees. And it's like put it all in. And for me, that was one of the lessons of my early childhood was, if you want to do something, my father said, just do it right and force yourself to go all in. And that's how we started Mangrove. It was like, we're all in. We're going to penny pinch as much as we can. We're going to get this fund going, and then we woke
I
up kind of in the summer of 2020, and I went, shit, the market has exploded in the US. It is coming to Europe, and okay, now we have to figure
yeah.
out a way to make some investments and
Yeah.
and be successful.
And we'll go there, Mark. But what I love about it, and I want the listeners to hear this, because sometimes we hear five no's and we're like, okay, this is a bad idea. Let me pivot.
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's a lot of it is about being all in. It is about the resilience. It is about building that conviction. But take me there, and take our listeners there. How do you build conviction when there's so many no's?
Yeah, well, you have to have, first of all, self-belief, right? That this is the right thing that you're going to do, because the no's come in different formats and from different people. And sometimes having to call your wife and tell you got another no, that's almost harder than somebody telling me, right? Because the last thing you want is your family to start going, are you sure you really want to do this, right? So
Right.
there's all that pressure that builds up in those moments. But, we were three founders, and so it was easy to huddle together. So I always like to tell people, I love to have started my company with at least one or two founders. You have a crutch, right? When you're down, they may not be down, and vice versa. And when you get a lot of no's, no matter what you think, you're going to have some down moments, because you go home and you go, God, another one, or
It's
you were so
hard.
close and then they said no, and things like this, which is, that's true for anybody starting any company. And it's whether
Right.
it's in tech or any other places, it's, you just got to be impervious to the no, and you're going to get hundreds of them, and you're going to get just enough yeses to start. And that's how lucky we got. And it ended up being from people, frankly, who knew us before.
Right.
Yes, in a different profession, in a different environment. And they were like, yeah, the markets may be weird, but, you guys are good guys, and, we're going to give you a shot. And so we ended up having, the government of Luxembourg invest in us, the biggest
Uh,
insurance company of Luxembourg invest in us. And, smaller countries, that may be a little easier, although I would argue that there's not that many investors either in
right.
smaller countries. So, you figure that out. But yeah,
Yeah.
the resilience to the no, the amount of tech companies I've been involved in who've succeeded kind of on their second pivot is quite remarkable, right? And
Right.
so those are the type of people you want to be involved with. It's like your
Yeah.
idea may be good today, your execution may be not so great, and your business model may be dodgy, but in a couple years,
You'll figure
and
it out.
that really, yeah, this
Thank
resilience really gave me the courage to do things that probably otherwise I wouldn't have done.
Yeah.
Like invest in Skype
I
when,
know. We'll
there
talk
were,
about it.
there were,
Yeah, we'll
yeah,
definitely go there.
there
Yeah.
were, there were competitive products already on the market from Google
Right.
and Apple, and people are like, you're completely nut job to be funding those guys. So I think you just have to think out of the box constantly. And that's really the world I try to operate in is I don't
Yeah.
want to be in the box.
Right.
Everything I do is about being contrarian. We
Right.
want to think. You want to zig when others are zagging, and you want to just be very different and have different perspectives.
I
And
agree.
I think that's what allowed us, really just to hold hands in tough times. I think a few months into our fundraising, I just remember we were in Geneva. A very big insurance company had said no to us. Here we are, three stuck in a shitty little Movenpick hotel, for 120 bucks for the night, and we're like, oh God, now we have to drive back to Luxembourg and just tell everybody that again we come back empty-handed. But look, that's it. It's what make
Amazing.
memories great, right? Yeah.
In retrospect. So, okay, so you raised the fund, but then you realize, oh my God, before we get to Skype, but you realize like, oh my God, like this is really happening. What do you
Yeah.
do? How do we recover? How do you sleep at night? Like, I don't know. I always feel like I'm going to get a heart attack in a second. So I'm just like, oh shit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think luckily we had a bit of experience, and we understood
Yeah.
that, this market would take time to develop. And so what we did is we said to ourselves, let's not invest our fund too quickly. Let's be slow, despite getting a lot of pressure from our investors. We're like, be calm. It's a bit like if you'd started a fund in
Right.
2020 or 21.
Yeah.
The advice I give to these young fund managers is, hey, if you have to, take 6 or 7 years to invest it. Yeah, but no, I'm like, no, no, no. You'll thank me later when the market tanks, and it's tough. So
Right.
we learned that lesson. It's like take a long time to invest. We were also on a very steep learning curve, right?
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, none of us had been venture capitalists before. We had to. There was nothing like an LLM today to give you a term sheet. There was none of that, right? So we had to invent how to write a term sheet, how to do this, how to do that. You know,
It's all
I'd
new.
say,
Yeah.
yeah, it's all new. And we made a few things. I think we did a few smart things early on, right? One is we resisted the temptation to not do it in our home country of Luxembourg. We initially, well, it's a small market. There's not a lot of stuff happening. And I think we naively said we can be successful here. But what it forced us is it forced us to travel 3 days a week. Like we couldn't
Wow.
just sit at our office and have the entrepreneurs come
Wow.
and visit us. We were, the rule of the firm was, which it still is today, you have to be 3 days on the road a week. You have to have at least 2 nights in a hotel somewhere. And when you're in one of those cities, you're not having lunch with a friend or dinner with a friend. You're socializing with people that can advance our business agenda.
Wow.
So you put those rules in, and I think that was really something we did very, very well, which is just force that down the throat of a very young organization. And this, often, we'll probably talk about Wix a little later, but, often what I like about what they do at Wix is they just have a very specific culture, right? And I think that's one thing that can make your company very successful is if at the beginning you say, here are the 5 things that matter to me and my partners, and we are simply not going to sacrifice on
Yeah.
those things, period,
That's
right? And
brilliant.
and
Yeah.
that was one of them, right? You are going to travel, you are going to go be social because that's what's going to
That's
get us that
amazing.
next great deal, right?
That's tremendous. And I can totally see, like what a shift that creates. And so take me then to Skype. So 2003,
Mm.
you find a company in a country that, I needed to look up the map the first time I heard they're from Estonia, if I'm being really honest.
Yeah.
And they had all these things against them. Take
Mm.
me through that moment. You find this thing. Why do you even bet on it? And by the way, my husband worked in Skype a little bit. So I'm like, so I know
Okay.
it from pretty
Okay.
close by. Yeah. So tell
Yeah.
me.
So, we knew that technology was coming down the path to be able to allow us to use, IP to make phone calls. So we
Right.
kind of knew this as technologists. And we were all frankly tired of, the traditional telco gouging us, right, to make a phone call based on distance.
Right.
When, yeah, that may have been true when you had to lay a copper cable under the Atlantic to go to the US, but nobody was doing that anymore, yet their pricing models were still the same. And so, we did a bit of research and said, okay, we think there's an opportunity to change the way communication is sold and priced and everything like that. And so this is one of the other things we did very well is every so often we come up with like this thesis, which it takes us about 18 months to write it out. And then it becomes the marching orders, right, for the partnership. Go find companies that do this. And that's a bit what happened, right, is we said, IP is going to change the world. We think there's this going to happen, and so on and so forth. And there's a huge opportunity because the telcos are gouging us. And so what could you do? Kind of at the same time, I met a friend of mine who was working for a very famous American venture capitalist called Bill Draper. His son is very famous, called Tim Draper, who's also a friend.
We just had him on the show, by the way. Yeah, Tim Draper.
He's just and I'll tell you a little bit. I learned so much from him through this experience. But I met the guy that was running his father's family office outside of the U.S. and we became friends. One of those, you got to have dinner with people when you travel. You got to socialize and things. And then we kind of both said, hey, we've heard that there's these guys who did Kazaa. And this was this music swapping file swapping business, and we're like, that seems to be like the most successful European company ever, and we got to meet these guys, right? And so we tried to figure out a way to meet them, and us on our separate ways, and a lot of things, and ultimately ended up meeting them and going, holy crap, these guys have this amazing vision of what they want to build. They have just product clarity. They have product genius in what they're trying to build. And they ended up being three people, a Swedish guy, a Danish guy, and an American guy. The American guy was their business development guy, and the two other guys were the techie. One was, another business guy, and the other one was just a product genius. And we just said, we're in when we met them. And it's sometimes you get that feeling, you meet a team, you're like, man, they're going to make something big, and, my partners originally were like, doesn't Google have a product like that? Doesn't Apple have a product like this? And I'm like, yeah, but you know what? These guys, they understand how to get rid of friction. And then it went, in our partners, they all went, bingo, and it was hard back then. You had to configure your security settings it was just like miserable. Today, of course, all that is forgotten. But so that was our view on Skype, and we're like in, and then Tim invested after that. Tim Draper invested after that, and I got to see. As a European, I got to hang out with Tim for 2 or 3 years. He is such an eclectic and such a smart guy. Again, always thinking out of the box. You might see some things that I've gleaned from him. Always thinking out of the box, zigging when others are zagging. And he was 15 years my elder and became an inspiration for, how we built and how we thought about building companies. Because Americans believe that there is no limit to what you can achieve. And Tim is in that camp, right? And so everything we talked about, everything he always said was like, this thing's going to be big for sure. We're going to take it public for sure. And it's infectious. And I think that's another one of the great lessons for us around Skype, but that we really embedded it in our firm's DNA is you got to think out of the box. There's no sense in investing where others are. And when you're there, man, oh man, be the best cheerleader you can for that business and just go for it. And that I thank Tim. Whenever I see him, I said, man, I learned all that from you. And you have to be big enough to say these things, right? Like, God didn't come down and make me a great venture capitalist. God gave me a lot of things, right, that I used, but that particular thing I thank Tim Draper for, because it was like he just had this belief that you could do anything. And that's what made Skype so successful.
That's incredible. I need to cut this and ship it to Tim. He would love to see this. This is so cool.
Yeah.
So, right, exactly. But take me there, and I agree. Like, these mentors are really, really important, and they're definitely a big part of every single person's life, right? And I love that you're also knowing how to give credit when credit is due. And take me there, though, to Skype, because you could see that they're incredible founders, but they needed to shift from the music industry. They were starting to be sued. They needed to pivot. And we talked about how founders, when they know how to cope with challenges and how to cope with these kind of feels like near-death experiences, they actually become stronger. Take me there for a second.
Yeah, I mean, but the CEO of Skype at the time, the founder, Nicholas Zentrum, he had worked in the telecom world quite a bit. And so he understood the problem of the telecom world. But their original vision, you see, what was interesting is, we early on, when we initially funded before they launched the product, right? So we didn't know what the product would look like. Their original product was slightly different than the ultimate product that you have seen as a success. Their product originally was Wi-Fi is coming everywhere, and we want to create a telco that will use Wi-Fi hubs around the city and everywhere as the network of choice. And so the vision was you could walk down your street and you would be handed off from one Wi-Fi network to another, right? And that would be the network of choice for them. And they build this telco business like that. The infrastructure around Wi-Fi was not quite developed enough at the time. And so their very smart decision was, well, we exist here. Let's throw a product out there that could work in that configuration, but let's get a bunch of users and then we'll be able to upsell them to something else. And of course, the minute they launched Skype, as you know it just went up and tens of millions of users. And that initial vision got put kind of in the back, and they just focused on building this, desktop first product. But it was just that, again, that vision was so strong and so powerful that you knew from the beginning that they would figure out a way to make it happen. And it was just, let's throw this little product out there and see how, if we get a bunch of users, they could be test users in cities and things like that. Ended up being, that never happened. And we ended up just going like this. A lot of challenges, how you recruited people, how, right. All of that. But look, it was also quite short. We invested in 2003, early 2003, sold in late 2005. So an unusual deal. It's an unusual deal in venture capital, and probably in that respect, a bad lesson for us because, we were like, this is what venture capital is about. You invested $3 million and you sell at $3 billion after 2 years, and you're like,
Not quite.
Of course, that's not what venture capital turned out to be, right? Everything is much longer, but every so often you get lucky enough to have something like that. But that was our first big success. And, everything, including that, became the basis of our DNA, right? Like this is this magic. And it's a bit like, it's a bit like a drug, unfortunately. Once you've had the taste of that success, you are empty until you find the next one because you just feel like, and, my kids, until Wix became very successful, right? Skype was my big success, and after a number of years, my kids are like, "Yo, bro, that's all you can talk about is Skype. You ain't got anything else, So your harshest critics are at home, about, come on, Dad, you got something better for me now, So
wow.
So
so take me there for a second, because I think you talked a little bit about this, and in the music industry we hear it, the one-hit wonder, right? It's like. There's like this fear of like, this can't be the only thing, right? And then you put a lot of pressure on yourself to frantically find the next one. Where is it catching you, Mark, at that point? And it sounds like your family is already taking you there, but so how was it?
I would tell you that, when we sold Skype, the sensation it gave me and my partners was a sensation of just ultimate joy. And we would be undefeated, but the problem with that is you should enjoy it, right? And move on quickly. And you could see how early on it began in the weeks right after it was announced and we sold, and we were all basking a bit in the glory of having been involved with that. You could see it popping up in various places in our own firm about people being a little too arrogant around it, right? And so I said to myself, look, we're going to let this joy be pure joy, and there'll be a bit of arrogance probably that comes with that. But after a month, this has to stop, right? So after a month, we sat down as a partnership and said, okay, Skype's done.
Let's go be hungry again.
now you got to go find something else. And by the way, lucky us, we have the brand of Skype behind us now, so it should make things easier and so on. But it's like, at the end, humility is one of the greatest skills that you should have in life. And for me, it was about that is we could be very successful, but we need to be super humble in everything we do going forward, because there was also a lot of luck in Skype for us, right? We were lucky we found them. We were lucky they wanted us to be part of the journey. We were lucky. So while you make your own luck, sometimes you got to say, hey, luck comes around, and let's make sure next time, we begin to have pattern recognition and all of that. But as an organization, I think we learned from that moment that just be a nice guy, be a humble person. I didn't build Skype. I was part of it, but I didn't do it on my own, and so I don't have a right to be like this. And so that was. But yeah, after the joy, and you wake up a bit like if you have a hangover after a month, and you go, oops, oops, now what? And yeah, well, while you're encouraged that you know how to do it, the truth of the matter, you're reminded by everybody that you're either a band with one hit or you're a one book wonder author, right? There's a lot of those out there. And the difficulty is, and all we could do, right, is say, we're going to continue down the path of doing the same thing. We need to make sure that we're taking enough risk. These are things that matter in our business. And so, we operate a business that unless we fail 50% of the time, I don't think we're taking enough risk. And so we track this very methodically. And because, when you start getting a little more gun shy, a little more comfortable, you just don't do deals like Skype. You just don't. And for us, it was important to maintain that really high level of risk tolerance, and at the same time, keep everybody very hungry. Look, the partnership, our investors in the partnership made a lot of money, and that was fantastic. But that's yesterday's news.
Right.
There's tomorrow's
What's
news,
next?
and we wanted to make tomorrow's news. Yeah, very important.
But tell me there, like, let's lean into this a little bit. I think some of the listeners don't realize, and maybe you'll correct me here, but venture capital is, there's a few things. First of all, you're going to say a lot of no's, like in just the general sense. It's going to take a lot longer on average to know if you're even good at this or not, right? So there's unlike the startup world or the business world where relatively quickly you can kind of see, here sometimes you need patience of years. So take me there a little bit. Like, how do you maintain the hunger? How do you maintain staff that is hungry? Take me there for a second.
Yeah, I mean, look, we were very fortunate that our first fund was the Skype fund. And so, we're able to demonstrate to ourselves, our employees, and everybody that, hey, there's a lot of money been made here. Not theoretical, it has been made. And, if we just follow this playbook, we should be able to do it again, right? The idea that it takes a long time, I'd say it probably takes a venture, any person that we might bring in now or anybody else, I'd say it's probably the 10-year journey to decide whether you're good at this, right? Exactly. Whether you ultimately decide, or if you were working at Mangrove, I would decide for you, right? But it is an 8 to 10 year journey, because you got to hustle like hell. You got to push yourself into deals. Sometimes you have to beg. I mean, I'm not beyond begging to get into a deal now, even, that's just what you have to do to get in. And so it takes time, but I think you then very quickly have to realize either you're good or you're not, right? I mean, there's a moment somewhere in that 6 to 10 year journey. It's pretty clear that either you are or you're not. And, we have to constantly keep the best. And so, you do rotate at that level, not a lot, but you do have to do it for the betterment of your own shareholders who, they're looking just to make money. That's the only reason why we exist for our shareholders, is to make money for them, right? And you have to accept that responsibility as well. But yeah, it takes much longer than, of course, starting a startup. But on the other hand, it's a lot more comfortable, right? I mean, you have a salary, you get well paid, you're stressed. People give you tolerance for stress because, of course, it takes time to become a venture capitalist, So you don't have the same level of stress as you would in a startup at all. Interesting.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, so then suddenly you run into Wix, and I want you to tell me that story of how did you create that pattern and said, you know what, that I want to bet on this Wix thing.
Yeah. So, Wix was, I met Wix in 2006, 7 in that time frame. And I had, this is a rather long story to get to my point, but I think we have time to tell it. I had funded a French entrepreneur a few years before, and I lost all my money with his one of those 50% that didn't work
wow.
out. But he did his aliyah, so he immigrated to Israel, right? And in 2007, he called me up and he said, hey, I really want to say sorry for having lost your money. I'm like, well, don't worry about it. This is the business we're in. He said, but I want to make it up to you. I want you to see the Israeli tech ecosystem. And so he says, come, I'll host you for 3 days. And so, I packed my bags and off I went to Tel Aviv. I had been, by the way, to Tel Aviv when I was 18 for the first time. I had taken the first flight from Cairo to Tel Aviv after the peace accords were signed. Yeah. And then, so then I went back in 2007, and of course, everything had changed and everything. But, I immediately went, holy smokes, 4-hour flight from Europe. We have probably, after Silicon Valley, the second most dense tech ecosystem of the world, right? And I'm looking around going, man, and it's a pretty virgin market in the sense of investors, right?
Oh, yeah.
I said, so there's an opportunity, and how can I leverage my reputation as the Skype guy, and these things.
And everybody loves Skype in Israel. Yeah, everybody loves it. Yeah.
So you start going, I can do this, and so on and so forth, and then serendipity led me, to meet the founders of Wix, and I met them, and I said, they just, again, it was a group of 3 guys. When I met them, I knew it just went click. I said, these guys are going to make it no matter what they do, right? These guys could do websites or anything else. I'd be like, I'm in, but of course they had a number of arguments that got me over the edge, but it was just like that initial, that initial romance. You go, man, I'm in love now, and I was like, yeah, these guys, boom, so that's kind of why, and it was, and I think the way I'm describing this to you now is exactly how I felt with the Skype guys and with most of our other successful companies. It's like it clicks right away. It can take you weeks and months after to close the deal if that's what happens. But me, I'm very much a people person, and I'd say 50, 60, 70% of my due diligence, right, is
the people.
I love them, I don't love them. Yeah. And so then I have to come back to my partners, and I have a few partners who are less people, more data driven, and so now I have to make my case. But that moment was just that moment. It clicked, and I was like, man, I need to be part of this. And just like when Skype figured out that they could kill the telcos, back then, building a website cost you $25,000 to $30,000, because you have to have somebody come and code it and everything. And I had learned from Skype the concept of free, and that was the greatest school that I ever went to. Right? It's like nothing beats free.
Yeah.
And so if I can give my product away, then there is no friction for people to use it if it's free. And I learned that at Skype. And then the Wix guy said to me, we're going to give these websites away for free. And then I said, okay, fine. How do we ultimately make money? And he said exactly what I was hoping he said was, I don't know, but we'll figure it out, right? But we're going to build this amazing platform that everybody's going to use. And it was revolutionary at the time, that they could build this amazing website, so easy and everything. And that, we'd figure out a way to make money. And luckily I had done Skype, so I wasn't worried about making money, meaning their business model, I didn't care about it. Now, that is very counter-cyclical, even till today in the venture community, right? A lot of the venture firms are focused on unit economics. And by the way, all of these are very important, right? I'm not debating them, but there's a moment where you see greatness, and that if they can make such a great product, it might take us a long time to figure out how to get paid, but eventually they'll get us there, right? And that's what happened. That's what happened.
And it's a decision between conquering the market or getting immediate revenue, right? I mean, and the VC's world, many times you need to conquer the market, and that's what both of these.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, we're living something similar in AI right now, except they're burning cash like drunken sailors. Back in 2007, of course, there was not so much capital on the market, and you had to figure out a way to do stuff that was not about burning cash. And so these guys, they built up this great tech team. They had a great CMO that started off with them, and they understood that if I give something great away for free, I'm going to have loyalty for a long time from my user base, right? And you see, that initial DNA that they had exists in Wix today, 20 years later, right? It's all about product greatness and how do they make it so that you will love the product. You're
Yeah.
not always successful. You're not always successful. Sometimes you come out with a crappy product, right? But inherent to your organization is about product brilliance, gets me loyalty, and then I have to figure out how to make money. And so we're on that
Right.
journey across many, many of these things.
And like I said in the beginning, like we are huge fans of Wix. I mean, we're still using it, even though there's a ton of other things on the market. I still think it's
Yeah.
the easiest by far. It's the most beautiful by far. But for me, and now I'll just kind of like say maybe a short story is I remember raising capital for my first company, and one of the investors said, "Well, like we want to invest in you, but I don't see anything on your Google, and I don't see anything on your LinkedIn, and like you don't have you're not known to anybody." Like, and I was just like,
Yeah.
I didn't realize I need to be known to anybody, like except for my own story. And that was the first time I realized I needed a website. And I looked at Wix, and like I said in the beginning, I think today every single person needs to have their own identity and their own economy and their own portfolio career, and it's going to be on something like Wix. Like, so anyway, so that's a shout out a little bit to you guys.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, and we're happy to hear you're a continued happy user of our products as they continue to evolve, and of course as we move into the AI world with the acquisition we made of Base 44, as you know, last year. It's been so far been terrific. So anyway, that's a bit the answer around Wix.
I love that. So take me back for a second, because you did tell Wix founders to turn down a $400 million.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a scary decision.
For
Take me
everybody.
there for a second. Yeah.
It's a scary decision for everybody, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this was we had an offer. It was, I think, let me think about it. Yeah, late 11, 12, something like that. And we had an American company called Vistaprint who made an offer to buy Wix, and very generous offer, by the way, at the time. It would have made the founders very rich. Certainly, our firms and other investors would have been very happy. But it occurred to me, looking at what they had built and how they had really thought through monetization, and I opened a parenthesis. It took them 26 different tries to get to their business model.
Wow.
Trying different things, and ultimately on try number 27, they didn't have a lot of hope that would work, and it did. And it was the dumbest of all business models, which is you can publish your website for free at Wix, but it'll have Wix in a URL. I take it away, you pay me, and that's how ultimately I
It's
make my money.
brilliant. Like, it's like so classic now in retrospect.
Exactly, and
It's
that
so good.
in retrospect, right back then, people were like, that's never going to work or whatever. But I remember going, man, they built such an amazing product. They just hung on to the idea that we're going to make money. They figured it out, and 400 million seemed low. Now, I remember we had sold Skype a few years before for 3 billion. So 400 seemed mentally not quite there. And I remember getting on an airplane and flying to Tel Aviv because I wanted to convince the guys not to sell.
Wow.
And I went there and I said, look, you guys can be so much more. You can be so much bigger. You have so much potential. I said, we could build one of Israel's greatest companies ever built together. And I said, I don't think you should sell. I said, however, I will respect whatever decision you make, because the money is important. I said, but I'm here really to argue why I don't think you should sell. And I remember after a lot of conversations and probably a few glasses of wine, and saying to the CEO, the founder, Avishai Avrami, I remember saying to him, okay, so what do you want to do? He says, well, look, of course I want to think about this. He says, but if anybody else had come here and told me this, I would have told them to go away. But you have proven you've done it with Skype, so I believe in that.
Wow.
And so I have faith that it's doable, right? And then he said, and oh, by the way, if we do that, and we walk away from this offer now, probably our only path is to go public at the point thereafter. And he said to me, and if we do that, you have to promise to stay on my board as long as I ask you. Now, I didn't want him to sell, so arguably I was willing to say yes to anything at that time. because I was so convinced he shouldn't sell. But of course, I said yes, and as you know, I'm still on the board of Wix today. So it's one of those moments where you make a deal, and that deal was that deal, and of course, I'm extremely happy to still be on and to chair the company and all of that. But that was one of those moments, right? These companies have just a few left or right decisions they have to make in life. Not many, just a few. But boy, do you have to make the right one when it comes your way. And that, I think, was just the right one. We've built an amazing company with amazing people. One of the underlying values that allowed them to grow is that the founders believed that stock options were very important for growing a business. And we have several hundred millionaires out of Wix. And that's if I were to sit down with the CEO and talk about what are some of the things we're proud of, that would be one of the things that we would both go, that's one of the proudest moments for us is, we were able to give that opportunity to so many people. It's all their hard work, right? But we created that opportunity when we said no, to Vistaprint, is we created that opportunity for others. And so
Right.
that's become for my firm now, one of the number one things we look at is generosity around stock option programs for people. Like
Yeah.
that's, we think, is so key to success.
Yeah. Well, I want to put a mirror for a second because I think you're specifically talking about the people in Wix or that invested in Wix.
Yeah.
I actually going to put a mirror thing because I'm sure I'm not, there's a lot of founders on Wix. We happen to be multiple $multi-million company and one of the fastest growing private companies. And it's all enabled because of Wix. So I also want to put a little bit of that, right? So I think the ripple effect of what Wix has created is a platform to allow us to service our communities in a lot easier way. And for all of us to create just this massive ripple effect on, I don't know, millions, billions of people. So I think that's what's beautiful about it. So a little bit of mirror here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. And, we take a lot of satisfaction as being, one of the enabling companies. There are many others, of course, but we think that, we think that what we've accomplished for the ecosystem is important in Israel. I think what we've done outside of it is also important. And this is born out of wanting everybody to just take advantage of the opportunities that their life gives them. And it's like, if you use our platform, great. We have other tools you can use. Base 44 now is helping other people do different things. Right. It's like we just want, our goal is to enable every internet user to be able to build the company, the dream, the thing that he or she wants to do, right? And we have a very broad suite of products. People simplify Wix to just a website building company. A website is a landing page, but it's also a fully functional, business processing product, which is complicated and everything. And we just think that's why we exist. And we exist to multiply that and give people every chance to be best. We have competitors and they're all great. We love them. We love to compete against these tech companies and we think that we're well positioned. But, the mindset of the CEO, the mindset of the founders, the mindset of the board is all about how do you build this business? How do you produce the best tools, the best products, right? So that you can continue to exist.
I love that. And I will ask you a few questions then, maybe just a few more. First of all, you are kind of known as being very contrarian, although I didn't feel it in this conversation. You're somehow known for it, but you've been so awesome. But I do want to hear a little bit, like sometimes when you say the truth, you also need you need thick skin to cope with, with everything that comes your way. Yeah. How do you build that thick skin? I think I need sometimes an extra, I need to buy extra thick skin somehow.
Yeah. I think, look, I have thick skin because, first of all, we do, we look at 2,000 investments per year and we make 5 investments.
Amazing.
So the first thing is, unfortunately, I say no a lot. And so that helps me understand. I fully understand what the no means, right? I got a lot of them when I started, but we have to do that a lot. We then have a 50% failure rate by design, right? From seed to A rounds, 50%. And so that's where the skin gets very thick, because whether it's me or my other partners, we know in every two companies we're going to invest, one is going to tank and we're not going to give them any more money. And so I think you do that. And the third part is, if you don't want to be opinionated publicly, then you have to be careful, because you will get criticized, right? But for me, I use it as a tool to, I don't just make comments passing like that. I'm very careful how I think through this. And usually I'll develop a thesis that I want to argue, right? So I might say, oh, I think, stock options matter for XYZ reasons. Or I might think, I might have a bash at a company for a period of time. But I do it always with a thesis in mind that says, here's my logic why I'm saying this. And of course, I often get people say you're an idiot and this and that, but that's just the natural presence of being in your job, right? Which is you're meeting people and we all have opinions. And I don't think my opinions are that important. They're important to my business and my shareholders. For everything else, I try to stay out of politics generally. I try to focus on, what I think are great messages for people to start businesses and do those things. But yeah,
Right.
thick skin is part of where we have to be. If you can't take it, don't dish it out. Is the other true lesson here.
I think somebody told me on this show, if you don't have haters, you're irrelevant. And I was like, great. I feel very relevant sometimes. A little too relevant sometimes.
Look, I mean, the world is a very busy place, right? And so the question is how do you pop above the fray? How do you have a voice that people want to listen to? I have friends for whom they have hundreds of friends. I have a few friends, but a lot of business acquaintances, and those things are different to me. But I'm very involved with my good business acquaintances, because fundamentally they are my multiplier of my business. And so,
Right.
You have to decide what game you're playing. There's popularity is useless, right? It doesn't advance you in any way, shape, or form. So I don't look for it. I want to be known as somebody who is fair, who is just, who is a good partner to do business with, and somebody who Wix says, I want you to be on my board forever with me.
Right.
That says more to me than I would say anything else would be around this.
Oh, I agree. So tell me what's coming. So when you're looking at you see, like you said, thousands of companies a year. The pace of change is something that we've never witnessed even close to it. How can you even make investment? Like nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone, and then AI exploded all the valuations. Like, how do we even, so first of all, where are we heading? What do you see, Mark? Tell us a little bit.
Well, look, I mean, AI has turned us all into superhumans, right?
Yeah.
And that's just a fact, and we have to be thankful for that, right?
Yeah.
Now, it also turns a lot of us into idiots, because we just repeat what it says, and these LLMs make a lot of mistakes, and there's example after example that I can give you there.
Right.
But there's no question that it's changing. It's changing how I look at a wine card when I go to a restaurant. It's changing how I build applications. It's changing how doctors are going to diagnose you in the future, right? So the revolution is boom, and it's early. And so, how do we as investors think about to take advantage of it? Well, we're looking down two paths very concretely around AI, right? One is verticalization. Right now, these generic LLMs are good at everything, but they're not great at anything, you see, because they're generalists. And so they're usually about 80% right, give or take. And so you can't be 80% right if you're running a bank. You can't be 80% right if you're a doctor, right? That just doesn't work. And so people have to build, AI companies that will use some components of these LLMs, but not only. You have to build your own tech stack as well. You can't just be a wrapper for OpenAI or Grok or those guys. And then you build something that has true, in my opinion, business logic. In the case of healthcare, which is a big space we're involved in, right? We think AI is going to fundamentally change the way hospitals are run and doctors do their work, and all this. Not to replace them. We have no desire to replace doctors. But what we want is that experience to be better for the person who's ill. And sometimes it means meeting a human. Sometimes it's about just convenience, right? Let me do a diagnostic using an app and things like that. And so I think verticalization is one, and then the whole enterprise gig is the other one. It's like, how do you crack the enterprise? Because there have not been, and again, I think it's through specialization and verticalization and things like that. So that's one area that I look at when I take out my crystal ball and say, where do I want to go? Of course, then there's subsectors, right? So, we're invested in an American-Israeli company, which is really one of the big leaders of healthcare called K Health. That's a really big one. They work with major hospitals in America. So, they're powering, Mass General, which is the Harvard hospital. They're, and a bunch of other hospitals. And so you can see inside how the user experience is better, how the hospital is better, and how the doctor's life is better. So you're like, it's win, 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 win for everybody. But we're not replacing anybody, So, and then AI kind of just gets into everything now. So, on Wix, if I want to build a website, I remember when I was building websites a few years ago, I'd be like stumped on the colors or on the copy. Like, what would I write on my website? Well, nowadays, you don't have to be worried because Wix does it all for you. So it's much easier. But so I think AI is going to be a big area that we focus on, of course. But the verticalization piece matters really a lot. And it'll then take over insurance. It'll take over all of these subsectors. There's going to be just a bonanza of specialized AI companies in those areas, and whether ultimately they put out of business great companies, they probably will, because those great companies will become incumbents themselves. And Wix today is viewed as an incumbent, right? Oh my God, who would have thought of that when we started? But so you have to reinvent yourself a lot in these tech cycles. What they do is they separate those companies that can reinvent themselves and those that can't. The other area we look around is, one of the problems with the internet, and not the AI, just generally with internet and online is everything, is it dehumanizes a little bit the relationships among people, right? Because you could walk into your house and your two kids would be on their iPads watching a different TV series. Your husband might be working at another one, and so on. So we think there's a whole area that you should be looking at as an investor around entertainment, things that bring humans together, right? And that could be, concerts, sports, all these type of things. And we're invested in a company called Project B. They want to kind of do basketball around the world in a different type of settings and things like this. And so, but for me, it's just all about how do you make people spend more time together to combat this problem called the internet and the online, which just makes it so that we don't spend any time. You've probably been in meetings where half the people in the meeting are sitting on their phones, and you're like, that's
what
not
happened?
cool, right? Like either we're hanging out together or we're not. So look, I'm guilty of that myself. And so that if I go out to dinner with my family, I don't take my phone with me just because I cannot keep off my phone. Like it's a drug for me, right? But so those are the areas that I think one should be focused on and things. And by the way, with all these tools, including Base 44 now, you can build anything you want. Now, you can imagine it, you can build it, you don't necessarily have to code it. But it has they all have limitations, right? I mean, building software is not just building the original product, but there's a lot of things behind it.
There's always a back end, but it's incredible. I think.
It's just the power that's being given to us, right? By these companies is just truly remarkable, right? I mean, we bought Base 44 last year, and we have a tremendous founder there. And the company is growing like gangbusters. But they're building, again, a la Wix, because for us, they're part of Wix now, and they're building very much in that same mindset as Wix. Great products, great infrastructure, one-stop shop. And over time, the view is build your website if that's what you want, build your identity if that's what you want, build apps if you want, build agents if you want. It's just making the creation process easier.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key. It's the creation process. Yeah.
Exactly. Because I think to download an idea and what you want to do into the reality, right? And I think that's what it makes it a lot easier. And for us, it's interesting. We've seen AI in different things in Leap Academy. One is to create your own personal brand, basically creating, how do you create a category of one in the fastest way possible without trillion assessment and trillion things. It's so easy to do now. And the other thing that we've seen with enterprises is how fast we can shrink the sales and marketing arena because it's still so old, right? Like you do the marketing and you meet again and then you do a demo and then you do, and it's amazing how you can shrink all of that and just shrink the sales cycle. So, you know, I
Now
think
I
it's an
would,
incredible time. Yeah.
yeah. Now I would say, and this is where I'll be probably contrarian here a little bit, is that, it's all fine to be drinking the Kool-Aid of OpenAI and Anthropic and those guys. But the truth of the matter is, you still have to be willing, you still have to know how to sell your product. You still have to be able to serve customers. You still have to be able to deliver. And so, it's a part of
True.
building your business. It is not the part of building your business,
Right.
despite what they want us to believe, right? And so, I tend to mute the conversations that come out of those. By the way, both are partners of Wix, fantastic tech partners. But, when you listen to them talk, don't forget they're drinking their own Kool-Aid. And the reality is that AI adoption is going to come in different speeds and different flavors and different organizations. It's not one size fits all. Like most tech trends, that will take time before it gets absorbed, right? And
Yeah.
by the general population and things like that. But boy, can you dream things like you could never before, for
Yeah.
sure. I just hope more people jump on the bandwagon of saying, my Lord, I don't have to know how to code anymore. I could go to base 44 and just create something absolutely stunning and perfect, and I could go and build my business. Or, we see
Yeah.
the amount of people who've used the Wix websites to build e-commerce businesses, big e-commerce businesses. And when you speak to them at conferences and things like this, they're just grateful for you having given them the
Exactly.
tools to express their identity, their individuality in building businesses. And that's super rewarding for us. And why we
Yeah.
think across our platform, that's the mindset that we have to drive forward every single day in everything that we do.
And that's why I like that you called it superhumans, right? You can just become a superhuman and you can just create whatever it is that you want to dream. And I love that. So maybe, Mark, one final question. Like, if you just kind of like met yourself many years ago, maybe in one of those dark moments for you, what would you wish somebody told you? Or what would you say to your younger self or to somebody listen to this call and saying, God, Mark, I want more out of my life. I don't know what it looks like. I either got laid off or I'm trying to figure out what's next and I'm seeing all the changes. What would you wish somebody told you?
I wish somebody had told me that your life is all about how much content you personally have, right? So that your ability to express thoughts and ideas are what makes you interesting or not interesting. And so the one way you can do that depends only on you, is by absorbing as much knowledge as possible. In the old days, you would say that goes through reading books, right? Read a bunch of books, become smarter. Maybe today you could go to Gemini from Google. They actually have a product that gives you say, I want to learn about stem cells, and it'll lay out a set of lessons for you to do that. But I would say invest in your knowledge base.
Yeah.
Be the smartest person you can be so that when you're in a group, when you're thinking with people, or when you're just trying to promote yourself, you have content. Because a lot of people are shallow and have no content. So that would be my advice to myself, like invest in yourself. Like there's no excuse, right? Yeah, you can't find a job and it's rainy and there's this. Fine. What you can do is read
Right.
every single day, for sure, 1 hour. So the advice I give to every single analyst that joins Mangrove is you need to be reading between 20 and 30 books per year. It shows you what the rhythm is. And that's a book every 2 weeks. That means you got to read, give 1 hour a day. And I say to them, it doesn't have to be after work. Do it at work, because the smarter you become, the smarter we become, right? As an organization.
Yeah,
And
nice.
so, and just read a lot of stuff. And I think what I'm expressing here is probably my education as in liberal arts, where my passion was history. It wasn't tech. It wasn't any of that. I was really passionate about history. And I think today that has served me really, really. It's just being intellectually curious all the time and recognizing that as if we're in a group of 10, how do you pop above all others? Well, you pop because you have more content, more value, you're more interesting. And that's what I would say. Invest in yourself more than anything, right? I can give 10 other lessons, but that's, if you ask me for
Yeah.
one, that's like the one that mattered.
The one. I love that. And I wish I understood earlier how much it's important to invest in yourself and your own knowledge
Yeah.
and because again, I think this is such a great feedback. Thank you, Mark. This was so good. I appreciate the conversation. Where
Yeah.
can they
Thank you very
find
much. This was
you?
fantastic.
And yeah, where can they find you and
Easy.
where, but
Very easy, easy, easy. Everybody can find me who takes 2 minutes to look. I'm very findable.
okay, perfect. So we'll have some
Ilana,
links in
thank
the
you.
show notes. That was awesome. I appreciate you, Mark.
All right, cool. Thanks again. I appreciate the time, and thank God we finally got together.
Hey, so I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. And I want to now go to the question of the week. And remember that it's all on our YouTube channel. So go to Leap Academy with Ilana Golan on your YouTube and make sure to ask your questions. I pick a person every single week. Sometimes it will bring them live. It's going to be so cool. But really, like right now, I found an incredible question from Margie. Thank you, Margie. And she asks a beautiful question about how do you land your first client when you don't have experience? And what a tremendous question, because you're right. You run into this chicken and egg. So the best way by far to land your first client when you don't have an experience, whether it's individual clients or corporate clients, is to do a research. And what I mean by this is reach out to people that are relevant. They're going to be in your network initially. It's people that you know. And in order to be more comfortable doing this, instead of a sales call, you're inviting them to a research call. What this means is something along the lines, it can't be a copy paste, right? This is personal, like you're reaching out to a friend, to a peer, to an employer, to somebody you know. Maybe they have the problem that you have that you're solving, maybe they don't, but you want to start collect information and collect lingo, right? And so you're going to reach out to somebody. So if you're helping people with losing weight, or you're helping people with their careers, or you're helping people with or companies with adopting AI, whatever it is, you're going to write, hey, like, so great seeing you after a long time. Like, I love following your journey, or whatever, right? Say something personal, and then say, hey, I'm passionate about helping driven professionals, or whatever it is, reinvent, leap their career after doing this for myself and doing this for a few people. Like, I'm just like really, really on a mission to help more people succeed. And I actually would love your input. Can we get on a quick call? That is it. That's how you get people to have a quick phone call with you. Now, the beautiful thing is on the phone call, this is not a sales call. This is a research call, right? Which makes it so much easier. And in that case, you just kind of ask them, hey, thanks for being on the call with me. For someone who, wants to lose weight, or somebody who feels stuck in their career, or somebody that wants to adopt AI, or whatever it is, right? Like whatever it is that you want to solve and help them. For someone who wants to solve this big pain in their career, what do you think is their biggest pain point? Right? And then I'm going to hear that they feel stuck, or they feel a fraction of who they could be, or they're not sure what's next for them, or they've been unemployed, or they've been, laid off, or they want to start a business, but they don't know how, right? Like that's our biggest pain point, the pain point that Leap Academy solves, right? Now you're going to ask them, hey, what's the biggest thing that do you think they're facing? How is it showing up in their life? Right? Do you think it impacts their sleep? Do you think it's impacts their health, their livelihood, right? And just start getting information. And you can also say about their dreams, right? And what do you think they actually want, right? What are they trying to do? And at the end of the conversation, you basically say, hey, do you know someone? I'm passionate to help people reinvent, leap their careers. Do you know someone that this can work for? So first of all, they might just say, hey, me, right? Or they might say, actually, maybe I know somebody. And that's by far the best way to start getting your first clients. So again, there's no pressure. It's not a sales call. It's just a research call. So you do your homework, find at least 10 people that you can have conversation with, and let's go. I can't wait, Margie, to hear your wins in our YouTube channel. I hope this is helpful. Cheers. More episodes that you're going to love are right around the corner, so definitely make sure to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, who in your life should see this today? Do share this with them. This will inspire and help those you care about and helps us continue to bring amazing guests. And I will see you there.